A stray dog stared at the rancher's cabin every day, until one day it never came. For weeks, that silent dog sat in the snow, watching like it was guarding a secret. And then, when it vanished, the rancher saddled his horse and rode out, only to find the dog bleeding in a trap and a starving Apache girl hiding in the brush. From that moment, nothing would ever be the same. A quiet rancher who thought his life was over suddenly finds himself standing against the railroad. The sheriff and the whole town, all because of one child and her wounded dog. But when lawmen drag her father in chains and a gunshot leaves, the dog broken in the dirt, the rancher faces a choice: stay silent or risk everything to stand for mercy, justice, and faith. Why did that dog keep watch at his cabin? And when the truth comes out, will this rancher's courage be enough to save the girl and himself from losing the only family he has left? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more The Frost-Tinged Morning Air Nipped at Carl. Mick Raw's weathered face as he stepped onto his cabin's wooden porch, his tin coffee cup warming his calloused hands. The sun hadn't quite crested the eastern mountains, but its pale light was already painting the Colorado sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. Steam rose from his cup, curling into the crisp October air like morning smoke from a distant chimney. His eyes, as they had every dawn for the past 3 weeks, drifted to the tree line where the scraggly dog usually stood watch. The creature had become as much a part of his morning routine as the coffee itself, a silent sentinel that neither approached nor fled. Just watched with knowing eyes that reminded Carl of something he couldn't quite place. "Reckon you'll be showing up any minute now," he muttered, scanning the edge of the ponderosa pines. Their branches swayed gently in the morning breeze, but no dog appeared between their trunks. Carl took a long sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. The morning silence pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional call of an early-rising meadowlark. Something felt different about the quiet today, emptier somehow. He waited longer than usual, until his coffee grew cold and the sun had pulled itself fully above the mountain peaks. Still no dog. Carl shook his head at his own foolishness. It was just a stray after all. No reason to expect it would keep coming forever. "Got work to do anyway," he said aloud, though the words felt hollow in the morning air. Setting his cup on the porch rail, he headed to the barn where his tools waited. The day stretched long before him, filled with the steady rhythm of mending fence posts. The work was simple but demanding, digging out the rotted posts, tamping down the soil around new ones, making sure the wire ran straight and true. It was the kind of labor that usually settled his mind, but today his thoughts kept drifting back to that empty space between the trees. The dog had been scarred. He remembered with a torn ear and a slight limp that spoke of old injuries, but its eyes had held something that drew Carl's attention. Not fear or wildness, but a steady, almost human awareness. Sometimes, when their gazes met across the yard, Carl could have sworn the creature understood more than any animal ought to dot as the afternoon sun began its westward slide. Carl found himself checking the tree line more often than necessary. Each time he looked up from his work, he expected to see that familiar shape emerging from the shadows. Each time there was nothing but wind-stirred branches and lengthening shadows. Ain't natural to miss something that was never yours to begin with. He chided himself, driving the post-hole digger into the rocky soil with more force than necessary. The impact jarred his shoulders, and he paused to roll them, feeling every one of his 58 years, when the sun finally touched the western peaks. Painting them in deep orange and purple, Carl gathered his tools and headed back to the cabin. His boots left clear prints in the evening frost that had already begun to form on the ground. The temperature was dropping fast. It would be a cold night. Inside the cabin, he lit the lamp and set about making a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The routine was familiar, but tonight it felt mechanical, empty of comfort. His eyes kept straying to the window, searching the gathering darkness for a shape that never appeared. After the dishes were done, Carl settled into his chair by the lamp. Sarah's Bible lay on the small table beside him, its leather cover worn, smooth by years of handling. He hadn't opened it much since losing her and their daughter Mary to the fever 5 years ago. But tonight his fingers traced the familiar spine. The lamp cast warm light across the cabin's plank walls, making the rough-hewn log seem to glow. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, its lonely cry echoing off the mountainsides. Carl found himself straining to hear any answering bark, any sign of the dog, but there was only silence. He picked up the Bible, its weight familiar in his hands. Sarah used to read from it every evening, her voice soft but sure as she shared the words that had guided their life together. She would have known what to make of this strange unease that had settled over him, this worry for a creature that had never even come close enough to touch. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she used to say, especially when things didn't make sense. Carl wasn't sure he believed that anymore, not since losing them. But tonight the memory of her words stirred. Something in his chest, the dog absence, nagged at him like a loose thread he couldn't help but pull. It had been so regular in its visits, so steadfast in its watching. Why would it suddenly stop? Was it hurt? Lost? The questions circled in his mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. Through the window, he could see the moon rising, its light casting long shadows across his property. The night was clear and still, stars pricking through the darkness. Like distant lanterns, it would be good weather for tracking come morning. Carl sat for a long while, the Bible in his lap, listening to the tick of the cooling stove and the soft creak of the cabin's timbers. Finally, he made his decision. Come first light, he would saddle his horse and search. It made no sense, perhaps, to go looking for a dog that had never belonged to him, but something in his heart told him it was the right thing to do. Your mama would say I've gone soft in the head, he murmured to Mary's memory, a slight smile touching his lips for the first time that day. But she'd probably help me look all the same. He checked his rifle was clean and ready, knowing he'd need it if he ventured far from the cabin. The nights had been getting longer, and with them came the wolves down from the high country. If the dog was out there somewhere in trouble, it might need more help than just finding its way back. As Carl prepared for bed, banking the fire and turning down the lamp, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, offering up a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for a scarred and lonely creature that had somehow worked its way into his daily life without ever coming closer than the edge of the trees. Lord, he whispered into the darkness, just let me find it. That's all I'm asking. The night settled around the cabin like a heavy blanket, but sleep was slow in coming. Carl lay awake, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant howl of coyotes, his mind already mapping out where he would search when dawn finally broke. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but for tonight he had purpose again. Something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until now. The morning dawned bitter cold, with frost glinting on every fence post and branch. Carl rose before the sun, his movements quick and purposeful as he pulled on his heavy wool coat and worn leather gloves. The familiar weight of his rifle settled across his back as he stepped out into the gray light of dawn. His bay gelding, Buck, stamped restfully in the barn, breath forming clouds in the cold air. Carl worked efficiently, brushing the horse's coat and checking each hoof before settling the saddle blanket and well-oiled leather saddle into place. The worn leather creaked as he tightened the cinch, prompting a slight grunt from Buck. Easy now, Carl murmured, patting the horse's neck. We've got work to do today. The sun was just clearing the eastern ridgeline when they set out, hooves crunching through the thin crust of snow that had fallen overnight. Carl guided Buck toward the creek, where he'd often seen the dog drinking or resting in the shade of the cottonwoods. Fresh snow made tracking easier, and his eyes caught sight of paw prints leading down toward the water. The creek gurgled softly beneath a thin sheet of ice, its voice muffled by the winter stillness. Carl followed the tracks along its bank, noting how they wavered and deepened in places as if the dog had been struggling. Something wasn't right about those tracks. A sharp yelp cut through the morning quiet, setting Buck's ears forward. Carl tensed, recognizing the sound of an animal in distress. He urged the horse forward, following the cries until they led him to a small clearing among the cottonwoods. There, partially hidden by fallen leaves and snow, lay the dog. Its leg was caught in the cruel jaws of a steel trap, and blood had stained the snow around it. The sight made Carl's jaw tighten. He'd never approved of such traps, having seen too many animals suffer needlessly in their grip. Dismounting carefully, Carl approached the trapped animal, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy there, friend. I'm here to help." The dog's eyes met his, full of pain, but somehow trusting, as if it remembered all those mornings of distant observation. As Carl knelt beside the trap, a sudden rustle from the cottonwoods made him freeze. His hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but what emerged from the trees stopped him cold. A small Apache girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, stood trembling in the shadows. She clutched a stick in her thin hands, holding it before her like a weapon. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, but she planted herself firmly between Carl and the dog. "It's all right, little one," Carl said softly, keeping his hands where she could see them. "I'm not going to hurt either of you." He noticed how she shivered in her thin dress, her feet wrapped in what looked like rabbit fur. She had to be half frozen. Girl Chloe, he would later learn, didn't move from her protective stance over the dog. The animal whined softly, trying to reach her despite its trapped leg. Carl could see the bond between them in that simple gesture. "That trap's going to keep hurting him unless we get it off," Carl explained, moving slowly as he reached for the trap's mechanism. "Will you let me help?" Chloe watched him intently, her stick still raised. The dog's quiet whimper seemed to decide. And she gave a slight nod. Though she didn't lower her makeshift weapon, Carl worked carefully, his calloused hand steady on the trap's springs. He'd freed animals from similar traps before, and knew the trick of it. Still, it took all his strength to force the steel jaws apart. The moment the dog's leg was free, it tried to stand, only to collapse with a yelp. Without hesitation, Carl pulled his red kerchief from his neck. "Hold still now," he murmured, gently examining the injured leg. The trap hadn't broken any bones, thank the Lord, but the cuts were deep and would need tending. He bound the leg carefully, wrapping the kerchief snug enough to slow the bleeding throughout his ministrations. Chloe had crept closer, her stick gradually lowering as she watched him work. Carl could see her shaking from the cold, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that worried him deeply. Snow had begun to fall again, thick flakes that promised more weather coming. "You two can't stay out here," he said, looking up at the heavy sky. "My cabin's not far. We can get you both warm and tend to that leg properly." He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. Though his concern grew with each passing minute, the dog tried to stand again, managing this time with Chloe's help, but it was clear it couldn't walk far. Carl considered their options, aware of how the temperature was dropping and the snow was falling faster. "Here's what we'll do," he said, moving slowly to his horse. Buck stood patiently as Carl adjusted the saddle blanket, creating a secure spot just behind the saddle. Then, with careful movements, he approached Chloe and the dog. "I'm going to lift him up first, then you. That all right?" Chloe clutched her stick tighter, but gave another small nod. The dog, surprisingly, offered no resistance as Carl gently lifted it, placing it securely on the blanket. Then he turned to Chloe, moving slowly and telegraphing his intentions clearly. "Up you go," he said softly, lifting her onto the horse. Behind the saddle, she was too light in his arms, and he could feel her trembling. The stick remained clutched in her small hands, but her focus was entirely on the dog. Now Carl mounted carefully, making sure not to disturb either of his passengers. The snow was falling steadily as he turned Buck toward home, the wind picking up and cutting through his heavy coat. He could feel Chloe shivering behind him, and the dog's warmth against his leg where it lay cradled on the blanket. The journey back seemed longer than usual, with Carl keeping Buck to a steady walk to avoid jostling his injured passenger. The snow thickened around them, beginning to obscure the trail, but Carl knew these paths by heart. Behind him, he felt Chloe gradually lean closer, seeking warmth, though she remained silent as a shadow, the sight of his cabin emerging from the swirling snow brought relief. Carl had no way of knowing then how this morning's simple search for a stray dog would change everything. All he knew was that he had two souls in need of help, and his Sarah had raised him to never turn away from such a calling dot as Buck carried. Then the final distance to the cabin, the snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks and wrapping the world in white silence. Carl's mind was already working through what needed to be done, tending the dog's leg properly, getting Chloe warm, finding out where she belonged. But those were concerns for after they were safely inside. For now, he focused on getting his. Unexpected charges out of the strengthening storm, the cabin door creaked open against the mounting snow as Carl helped his passengers inside. The warmth from the banked morning fire had long since faded, leaving the single room cold and unwelcoming. Carl knew his first task was clear: get some heat back into the space. "Let's get you both settled," he said quietly, helping the dog limp to a spot near the stone fireplace. Chloe followed close behind, still clutching her stick, her eyes darting around the cabin's interior like a trapped sparrow. Carl moved with deliberate care, not wanting to startle either of his guests. He stacked kindling in the fireplace, his movements practiced from years of frontier living. Soon, a small flame caught, growing steadily as he added larger pieces of split oak. The fire's warm light filled the cabin, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "There now," he said, mostly to himself. "That'll take the chill off." He hung his snow-crusted coat by the door and moved to the kitchen area, where a pot of yesterday's stew sat covered on the back of the stove. As he worked to rebuild the cooking fire, he kept one eye on Chloe, who had positioned herself between the dog and the door, her small frame tense with WTXF and lay quietly where Carl had placed it, occasionally lifting its head to lick at the makeshift bandage. The wound needed proper cleaning and dressing, but first, Carl reckoned, they all needed to warm up and find some measure of comfort with each other. He set the stew pot on the warming stove and reached for the bread box, pulling out a half loaf he'd baked 2 days prior. When he turned back, he found Chloe's dark eyes fixed on his every movement. She flinched visibly when he took a step in her direction, and he stopped immediately, changing course to set the bread on the table instead. "Hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice soft. He tore off a generous chunk and placed it at the edge of the table closest to her. "It's for both of you," he added, nodding toward the dog. Chloe remained still for a long moment, studying him. Finally, she inched forward, snatched the bread, and retreated to the dog's side. Carl noticed how she broke the bread carefully, offering the larger portion to the animal first. Only after the dog had eaten its share did she take tiny bites of what remained, as if making it last. While the stew heated, Carl gathered what he needed to tend the dog's injury: clean rags, a pot of water, and a jar of honey he kept for medicinal purposes. He'd learned long ago that honey helped prevent festering in wounds. Setting everything on the floor near the fireplace, he sat down on his heels, keeping plenty of space between himself and his guests. "That leg needs cleaning," he explained, meeting Chloe's worried gaze. "I won't hurt him, but it might sting a bit." He waited until she gave a slight nod before unwrapping his blood-stained kerchief from the dog's leg. The wound wasn't as bad as he'd feared. The trap's teeth had cut deep but clean. As he worked, washing away dried blood and applying honey with gentle fingers, the dog lay surprisingly still, as if understanding the necessity of the treatment. Chloe watched every movement, her hand resting protectively on the dog's neck. "There," Carl said at last, securing a fresh bandage. "That should heal proper now." He pushed himself to his feet, his knees protesting the movement. The stew was bubbling gently on the stove, filling the cabin with savory warmth. While he ladled portions into 2 bowls, Carl tried again to connect with the silent child. "My name's Carl," he offered. "Carl McGraw." He set a bowl on the table, along with a spoon, and stepped back. Chloe's gaze moved between him and the steaming bowl. Her stomach growled audibly, but still she hesitated. Carl sat down at the far end of the table with his own bowl, making a show of eating slowly, giving her time to gather her courage. Finally, hunger won out. She approached the table cautiously, never taking her eyes off him as she perched on the edge of the chair. The spoon trembled slightly in her small hand as she took her first bite. "Chloe," she whispered suddenly, so soft he almost missed it. "Pardon?" Carl asked, careful to keep his voice gentle. "My name, Chloe." She touched something at her neck, a delicate necklace made of small shells strung together. Carl recognized it as the kind of craft Apache women made for their children, a sign of family and belonging that made his heart ache with questions he knew better than to ask just yet. They finished their meal in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft whines of the dog as it shifted position. Outside, the storm had settled in properly. Wind whistling around the cabin's corners and driving snow against the single window. After supper, Carl gathered every spare blanket. He owned creating a soft bed near the fireplace. "You and your friend can sleep here," he said, stepping back to let Chloe inspect the arrangement. She ran her fingers over the topmost blanket, a colorful quilt Sarah had made years ago, before finally settling down beside the dog. Carl added another log to the fire and turned down the lamp, leaving just enough light to see by. He moved to his own bed in the corner, fully dressed except for his boots, wanting Chloe to feel safe in his presence as he lay there, listening to the storm and the soft breathing of his unexpected guests. Carl's mind drifted to another little girl who had once brought light to this cabin. His daughter Mary had been about Chloe's age when fever took her and Sarah both, leaving him alone with his grief and his faith. The memory still cut deep, but tonight it carried a different weight. Looking over at Chloe's small form curled protectively around the dog, he felt something stir in his heart, a familiar ache of loss. Yes, but also something else. Something that felt almost like hope, though he hardly dared name it as such. Snow continued to fall outside, building drifts against the cabin walls and muffling all sound except the gentle pop and hiss of the fire. In its warm light, Carl watched as Chloe's eyes finally drifted closed, her hand still resting on the dog's fur. The animal lifted its head briefly, meeting Carl's gaze with what seemed like understanding before laying its muzzle back down on its paws. Carl lay awake a while longer, his mind full of questions about where Chloe had come from and what circumstances had left her alone in the winter woods. But those were worries for tomorrow. For now, she was safe and warm, and that would have to be enough. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Colorado mountains. Carl stood at his cabin window, watching the sun paint the fresh snow in shades of pink and gold. Behind him, Chloe slept, soundly near the banked fire, the dog's head resting on her small shoulder. He needed supplies. The extra mouths to feed had depleted his stores faster than expected. Moving quietly, Carl pulled on his heavy coat and boots. He scribbled a quick note on a scrap of paper, though he wasn't sure Chloe could read it. Still, leaving it on the table felt right. "I'll be back before dark," he whispered to the sleeping pair. Neither stirred as he eased the door closed behind him, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Carl's breath frosted as he made his way to the barn, where his bay gelding nickered a greeting. He took extra care with the saddle cinch, knowing the steep trail into Pine Ridge would be treacherous after the snow. The sun had climbed 3 fingers above the mountains by the time Carl guided his horse down Pine Ridge's main street. The small town was stirring to life, smoke rising from chimneys, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks clear of snow. Carl tied his horse at the hitching post outside Whitaker's general store, stamping his boots clean before stepping inside. The store's bell jingled as he entered. Tom Whitaker looked up from his ledger, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Morning, Carl. Ain't seen you in a spell." "Morning, Tom." Carl pulled his list from his pocket. "Need some flour and salt, few other things." As Tom gathered the items, the bell chimed again. 2 men Carl recognized as ranch hands from the Sterling spread stomped in, bringing with them the sharp scent of winter air and tobacco. A whole band of 'em down by the creek bottom, one was saying, making themselves right at home on Sterling land. Trespassing Indians, you mean? The other replied, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet store. Sheriff ought to run 'em off before they get too comfortable. Carl kept his face carefully neutral as he counted out coins for his purchases. His heart had begun beating faster, though, thinking of Chloe sleeping in his cabin. Terrible business, that, Tom said, shaking his head as he wrapped Carl's items in brown paper. Railroad pushed them off their usual camping grounds. Now they're scattered everywhere, making everybody nervous. The store's bell rang once more. This time, a tall man in a black coat entered, snow dusting his shoulders. Carl recognized him as the circuit preacher who rode through every few months. "Good morning, brothers," the preacher said, removing his hat. His sharp eyes took in the gathering, lingering briefly on Carl. The ranch hands nodded respectfully before. Taking their leave as they went out, Carl heard one say, "Sheriff's gathering men tomorrow. Gonna make sure they move on." Carl lingered, pretending to adjust his packages while the preacher selected a few modest items. When both men stepped out onto the boardwalk, the preacher touched Carl's arm. "A moment, Mr. McGraw." They moved away from the store's window. The preacher's face was grave in the winter light. "I've been riding between the settlements," he said, quietly. "Those families by the creek, they're good people. Had grazing rights guaranteed by treaty until the railroad decided it needed that land for the new spur line. Now they're scattered, trying to keep their children fed through winter." Carl's throat felt tight. "Children?" he asked. The preacher nodded. "Several families, some little ones among them." He paused, studying Carl's face. "The sheriff's taking his orders from the railroad foreman now. They mean to drive these folks out, no matter the weather or what's right by God's law." "Ain't right," Carl said, the words coming before he could stop them. "No, brother, it ain't." The preacher gripped his shoulder briefly. "We must pray for guidance in these times. And remember that the Good Samaritan didn't ask which tribe his neighbor belonged to before showing mercy." Carl mounted up his purchases, secure in his saddlebags. The preacher's words echoed in his mind as he rode out of town. The sun was already well past its peak. He'd lingered longer than intended, troubled by what he'd learned. The afternoon light was fading when Carl finally caught sight of his cabin. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. He'd shown Chloe how to tend the fire before he left. As he approached, he saw her small figure dart from behind the cabin to the safety of the door. The dog limping faithfully at her heels. Inside, warmth and the smell of coffee greeted him. Chloe had managed to heat water in the pot he'd left, though she'd used rather more coffee grounds than needed. The thought of her trying to take care of things in his absence brought an unexpected smile to his face. "Thank you," he said, hanging up his coat. She watched him from her usual spot near the fire, the dog between them. "You did good with the fire, and the coffee, too." Chloe didn't speak, but some of the tension left her shoulders. She had saved scraps from breakfast, he noticed, and was feeding them carefully to the dog. The animal's leg was healing clean. No sign of infection in the wound. Carl put away his purchases, then knelt slowly beside Chloe and the dog. The animal's tail thumped once against the floorboards, and Chloe didn't edge away as she had before. "You're safe here," he said quietly, meeting her dark eyes. "Nobody's going to harm you while you're under my roof. That's a promise." She studied him for a long moment, then reached out to touch his sleeve, the first time she'd initiated contact. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Carl's heart squeezed at the trust in that small gesture. But worry gnawed. At him too, knowing what he'd learned in town? Word would spread. Questions would be asked. The sheriff and his men would come, sooner or later, that evening. After Chloe had fallen asleep by the fire, Carl sat at his table with Sarah's Bible open before him. The lamp cast a gentle glow over the well-worn pages as he searched for guidance. His finger-traced familiar verses, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." And later, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was a stranger and you took me in." The words were clear enough. But the path ahead, that was harder to see. Carl bowed his head, his whispered prayer barely stirring the quiet air. Lord, show me how to protect this child. Give me the wisdom to do what's right and the courage to see it through. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness. The dog lifted its head, ears pricked, then settled again with a quiet sigh. Carl watched Chloe sleep, her face peaceful, in the firelight, and knew that whatever came next would test both his faith and his resolve. The morning after, Carl's trip to town dawned clear and cold. He stood at his cabin door, watching Chloe make her way carefully across the yard, carrying a small bucket of water from the well. The dog hobbled beside her, its injured leg healing but still tender. Carl marveled at how quickly she'd taken to the morning chores he'd shown her. Inside the cabin, warmth from the cook stove had driven away the night's chill. Chloe set the bucket down near the wash basin, then picked up the broom she'd left in the corner. Without being asked, she began sweeping the wooden floor, working methodically from the door toward the hearth. The dog settled in its usual spot by the fire, watching with alert eyes. "Thank you," Carl said, the words coming easier now. He pointed to the broom. "Sweep, sweep," Chloe repeated softly, testing the word on her tongue. She continued her task, pausing now and then to study how Carl prepared their breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples dot as they ate. Carl noticed how she'd already adopted his habit of saying grace before meals, bowing her head when he did. Though she spoke little, her dark eyes missed nothing. She watched intently as he washed the dishes, then dried them herself when he handed each one to her. "Bowl," he said, passing the cleaned item. "Bowl," she echoed, carefully setting it on the shelf. "Cup, cup." The word came with a slight smile this time. Their days fell into an easy rhythm. Each morning, Chloe helped with the indoor chores while Carl tended to the livestock. She proved quick to learn the names of things. Plate, spoon, chair, table. Carl found himself looking forward to teaching her new words. Pleased when she'd point to objects and name them UMPROMPTED. In return, Chloe began sharing words from her own language. When they walked to check the fence line one afternoon, she pointed to the towering peaks on the horizon. "Jill," she said clearly, then touched Carl's arm to be sure he was listening. "Mountains?" "Jill," Carl repeated, the unfamiliar word rough in his mouth. Chloe's quiet laugh told him he hadn't quite managed it, but she nodded encouragement. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Chloe named the stars as they appeared. "So," she said, pointing upward. "Star." The dog lay between them, its head on its paws, occasionally thumping its tail when either of them spoke. Its presence had become as natural as the creek's burble or the wind in the pines inside the cabin. Later, Carl settled at the table to work on a set of leather reins that needed mending. The familiar task was soothing, pulling the worn leather through his hands, working it with neat stitches by lamplight. Chloe sat cross-legged by the fire, running her fingers through the dog's fur. Then, so softly at first, Carl wasn't sure. He'd heard it. She began to sing. The melody was unlike anything he knew. It rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, ancient and pure. Though he couldn't understand the words, something in the song's gentle cadence reached deep into his heart. His hands stilled on the leather as he listened. The tune reminded him powerfully of Sarah, his late wife, and how she would sing hymns while working in their cabin. Amazing Grace had been her favorite, her clear voice lifting the simple words toward heaven. Carl hadn't heard music in his home since her passing 3 years ago. Chloe continued singing, her young voice carrying the lullaby's melody like a precious thing. The dog's eyes had closed in contentment, and the fire crackled softly in counterpoint. To the song, Carl felt moisture gather in his eyes, but it wasn't entirely from sorrow this time. When the last note faded, silence filled the cabin for a long moment. Then Carl cleared his throat. "That was real beautiful," he said quietly. Would you sing it again?" Chloe studied his face in the lamplight, then nodded. As she began the lullaby once more, Carl returned to his leather work, his stitches, falling into rhythm with the song. Something that had been knotted tight inside him for years began to loosen. Like ice melting in spring dot the next morning, Carl found Chloe had already drawn water and fed the dog before he rose. She stood at the window watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. The sight of her there, small but somehow belonging, made his cabin feel more like a home than it had in years. But as he watched her, worry gnawed at his thoughts. Somewhere out there, her family was struggling to survive the winter, harried by the sheriff and his men. The railroad's greed had scattered them like leaves before a storm. Carl knew the peace they'd found couldn't last, not while injustice stalked the creek bottom where her people camped. For now, though, he pushed those dark thoughts aside. Chloe turned from the window and gave him a shy smile. "Morning," she said carefully, one of the first English words she'd mastered. "Morning," Carl replied, and set about starting the day's fire. The dog limped over to greet him, its tail wagging hopefully until he spared a moment to scratch behind its ears. Through the window, he could see fresh tracks in the snow, Chloe's small prints beside the dog's three-legged trail, marking their morning journey to the well and back. These simple signs of life and trust, Carl realized, had become precious. To him, whatever trials lay ahead. He knew God had sent this child and this dog to remind him that even the loneliest heart could find companionship again. His empty cabin had become a sanctuary, filled with shared words, gentle songs. And the quiet faith that doing right by others was its own kind of prayer. Chloe began humming her lullaby as she swept the floor, the dog following her path across the boards. Carl added wood to the stove and began preparing breakfast. Letting the familiar melody wash over him like a blessing, the morning brought more snow, thick flakes falling in silent waves from a steel-gray sky. Carl stood at his cabin window, watching the white blanket deepen across his land. The thermometer outside read 15 degrees, and the wind cut sharp enough to make his horses huddle close in the barn. Inside, the cabin stayed warm, thanks to the steady fire Chloe kept fed. She'd learned quickly how to bank the coals overnight and wake them in the morning. Now she sat cross-legged by the hearth, sharing her breakfast cornbread with the dog, who took each piece as gently as a lamb. Carl's worry grew as he counted their dwindling supplies. The flour barrel showed bottom, and the salt pork wouldn't last another week. He'd need to make another trip to town soon, though the thought of leaving Chloe alone, even briefly, troubled him. The sound of hoofbeats through the snow drew his attention. Carl squinted through the frost-edged glass, making out a rider approaching through the swirling white. The dog's ears pricked up, and it moved to stand between Chloe and the door. "Stay inside," Carl told her quietly, reaching for his coat. She nodded, one hand settling in the dog's fur. The rider pulled up before the cabin, his horse's breath steaming in the cold. Carl recognized him as the railroad foreman, a citified man named Harrison who'd been surveying land all autumn. His fine wool coat and polished boots marked him as a company man, someone used to giving orders and having them followed. "McGraw," the foreman called out, not bothering to dismount. "Word in town is you're harboring trespassers." Carl stepped onto his porch, closing the cabin door firmly behind him. "This is my land, Mr. Harrison. Ain't harboring nobody that ain't welcome here." The foreman's mouth tightened. "Those Indians camping down by the creek, they're interfering with railroad business. Company's got legal right to that land for the new track." He leaned forward in his saddle. "We know one of their youngsters is here. Turn her over, and there won't be trouble." "Trouble?" Carl's voice stayed level, though anger stirred in his chest. "Seems to me the only trouble is men taking what ain't theirs to take. Progress doesn't wait on sentiment, McGraw. Railroads coming through, whether folks like it or not." Harrison's gloved hand tapped meaningfully on his saddle horn. "You got good grazing rights here. Be ashamed to lose them when the tracks push west." Carl thought of his Bible sitting open on the table inside, of the words he'd read just that morning. Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "My rights come from God above, not your railroad company," he said firmly. "That child stays here, safe and warm, long as she needs to. Same goes for her kin down by the creek." Harrison's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, old man." A railroad doesn't forget those who stand in its way. He gathered his reins. I'll be back, and next time it won't be for a friendly conversation. Reckon you'll do what you must, Carl replied steadily. Same's I will. The foreman wheeled his horse around, sending snow flying. You've been warned, McGraw. Whatever comes next is on your own head. Carl watched until horse and rider disappeared into the swirling white. Only then did he let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. The sound of the cabin door opening made him turn. Chloe stood in the doorway, the dog at her side. Her dark eyes were serious, understanding more than her limited English might suggest. Carl knew he needed to explain what had happened to prepare her for what might come. Back inside, they sat at the table while Carl searched for simple words. Bad men, he began, pointing in the direction the foreman had gone. They want to hurt your family. Take their home. Chloe nodded slowly. Railroad, she said, surprising him. She'd obviously heard the word before. Yes, Carl confirmed. But I won't let them take you. Won't tell them where your family is. He touched his chest. You're safe here. Promise. Chloe studied his face for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached across the table and took his weathered hand in her small one. Her grip was firm, full of trust and something more, a recognition of the bond forming between them. The dog moved closer, resting its graying head across their joined hands. Its warm weight completed the circle, 3 lonely souls finding family in each other. Carl felt his throat tighten with emotion. They sat like that for several heartbeats, while the snow fell outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. No words were needed. The touch of hands said everything about loyalty and protection, about choosing what's right over what's easy. Finally, Chloe released his hand and rose to tend the fire. The dog followed, limping less now as its leg healed. Carl watched them, knowing he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. Whatever trouble the railroad brought, they would face it together. The rest of the day passed quietly. Carl split more firewood while Chloe swept new fallen snow from the porch. The dog kept watch from the doorway, alert for any sign of returning riders. By evening, the snow had stopped, leaving the world hushed in white dot after supper. Carl read aloud from his Bible by lamplight, his finger moving slowly across the verses. Though Chloe couldn't understand all the words, she listened intently, perhaps hearing in his voice the same comfort he found in the ancient promises of justice and mercy. Outside, an owl called through the darkness. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, but it didn't stir from its place by the fire. Carl glanced at Chloe, who had begun humming her gentle lullaby while she mended a tear in her shawl. The scene struck him suddenly. How natural it felt. This small family they'd become. The railroad foreman's threats seemed distant against the simple peace of their evening routine. Yet Carl knew tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The railroad never backed down easily, and Harrison would make good on his warnings. For now, though they were safe and warm, bound together by choice and circumstance and something that felt very much like love, Carl returned to his Bible reading, letting the familiar words wash over them like a blessing. Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. The dog sighed contentedly, and Chloe's humming blended with the pop and crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow continued its silent work of covering their tracks, while inside, 3 hearts beat as one in defiance of the coming storm. The morning air, bit sharp and cold, as Carl trudged through knee-deep snow, axe balanced on his shoulder. Behind him, Chloe and the dog followed in his tracks, their breath clouding in the December chill. They were searching for the perfect Christmas tree, not too tall, since the cabin ceiling was low, but full and green enough to bring some cheer to their home. How about that one? Carl pointed to a young pine, about 5 feet tall, standing slightly apart from its taller brothers. Chloe circled it, nodding with approval. The dog sniffed around the trunk, tail wagging through the powder snow. Carl squared his shoulders and began chopping. The axe blade bit deep with each stroke, sending chips of wood flying. The sharp scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air. With a final crack, the tree toppled softly into the snow. "Here now," Carl said, handing Chloe a length of rope. "You take one end, I'll take the other." Together they dragged their prize back toward the cabin, the dog prancing alongside. Inside, Carl fixed the tree in an old bucket filled with rocks and water. Chloe immediately began decorating, weaving strings of dried berries she'd been saving since fall. She added pine cones gathered from the forest floor, some dusted with the last of Carl's flour to look like snow. When she ran out of decorations, she fashioned stars from scraps of paper, carefully folding them the way her mother had taught her. Watching her work, Carl made up his mind about something he'd been pondering for days. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and no one should spend it separated from family. He knew where Chloe's people were camping, had known for weeks, though he'd never mentioned it. Perhaps it was time to bring them together, even if just for one. "Night, Chloe," he said softly, waiting until she looked at him. "Would you like your family to come here for Christmas supper?" Her eyes widened with joy and disbelief. "Family? Here?" Carl nodded. "Tomorrow night. I'll go find them, invite them." "Proper like." Chloe threw her arms around his waist, hugging him tight. The dog barked once, catching their excitement. Carl patted her shoulder, his throat tight with emotion. The next morning, Carl rose before dawn. He packed his saddlebags with some dried meat and coffee as peace offerings, then rode out toward the creek bottom where Chloe's people were hidden. The dog tried to follow, but he ordered it to stay, knowing it would help guard Chloe. He found the camp tucked away in a sheltered hollow. Smoke rose thin and nearly invisible from carefully managed fires. Carl dismounted and waited at a respectful distance, hands open at his sides, until two men approached. One was Chloe's father. Carl recognized him by the same proud bearing. His daughter carried. "Your daughter is safe," Carl said clearly, meeting the father's eyes. "She's been helping me at my cabin. I've come to invite you, all of you, to share Christmas supper with us tonight." Chloe's father studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke in careful English. "Why help us?" "Because it's right," Carl answered simply. "And because no family should be apart at Christmas." After a long pause, Chloe's father nodded once. Words passed between the men in Apache, and Carl saw relief flash across their faces. He gave them directions to his cabin, explaining they should come after dark to avoid being seen. Back home, Carl and Chloe spent the day preparing. They swept the cabin floor, set out every plate and cup Carl owned, and prepared as much food as they could manage. Carl had shot a young deer 2 days before, and now its meat roasted slowly by the fire. Chloe mixed and shaped biscuits the way Carl had taught her, her small hands careful with the precious flour. The dog kept watch at the window as darkness fell, along with fresh snow that would cover any tracks. Just after sunset, soft knocks sounded at the door. Carl opened it to find Chloe's family, father, mother, and 3 younger siblings, standing in the swirling snow. Chloe flew into her mother's arms while Carl welcomed them inside. The cabin, usually so spacious for just 2 people and a dog, filled quickly with warmth and life. The younger children stared in wonder at the decorated tree while their mother brought forth small bundles of herbs and dried foods, gifts from their winter stores. Carl set extra places at his table, bringing out his finest tin plates and his mother's old serving bowl. Steam rose from the roasted venison, and the biscuits came out golden brown. Before they ate, Chloe's father spoke a blessing in Apache, his deep voice filling the cabin. Carl followed with the Lord's Prayer, the words mixing together like music. Meal passed in a broken English, Apache words, and the universal language of shared food and smile. Carl carved the meat while Chloe's mother served portions to everyone, including a few choice bits to the dog who sat hopefully nearby. The younger children giggled at first, shy around the white-haired rancher, but soon they were showing him their treasured objects: a carved wooden horse, a string of beads, a feather from a blue jay. After supper, Carl brought out his wife's old hymnal. Though some of the pages were worn thin with age, the Christmas songs were still clear. He began singing Silent Night, his rough voice carrying the familiar tune. To his surprise, Chloe's mother knew some of the words, learned years ago at a mission school. She joined in softly, then began teaching her children the chorus. Soon the cabin rang with a beautiful mix of voices. English hymns and Apache melodies weaving together like bright threads in a blanket. The children played with the dog, who had grown gentle and patient in its healing time with Chloe. Even Chloe's father relaxed, sharing with Carl the names of stars in his language and listening to Carl's stories of winters past. The fire burned, low and warm, casting golden light on faces that no longer held any trace of suspicion or fear. For this one blessed evening, they were simply family, sharing the peace that Christmas brings to all people of goodwill. Looking around his cabin, Carl felt tears prick at his eyes. How long had these walls known only silence? Now they glowed, with lamplight and laughter, with children's voices and women's songs, with the simple joy of breaking bread together. This, he thought, was what his wife would have wanted, the cabin alive again, with warmth and welcome. Snow continued falling outside, muffling the world in white silence. But inside the cabin, hearts and hands joined in friendship stronger than any law or railroad decree could break. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they had this night of grace to hold close in memory. The younger children began nodding off by the fire, curled up with the dog on Carl's old quilt. Their mother gathered them gently, wrapping them in warm shawls. For the journey home, Chloe hugged each family member tightly, especially her father, who held her close and whispered words of love in their own tongue. Before they left, Chloe's father turned to Carl. "Thank you," he said simply, touching his heart. "For my daughter? For this night?" Carl nodded, his own heart too full for words. He watched from the doorway as the family disappeared into the snowy darkness, their tracks already filling with fresh powder. The dog whined softly beside him, and Chloe slipped her small hand into his dot. Together they closed the door against the cold. But the warmth of that Christmas gathering stayed with them, a light to hold against the darkness of winter. And the uncertain days ahead, 3 days after Christmas, the winter morning dawned bitter cold. Carl stood at his cabin window, coffee cup warming his hands, watching the sun cast long shadows across the snow. The dog lay curled at Chloe's feet near the stove, its injured leg healing well enough to bear weight now. The peaceful scene before him made the distant sound of approaching hoof beats all the more jarring. Carl set down his cup and moved to the door, motioning for Chloe to stay back. Through the frost-rimmed window, he counted 6 riders moving fast toward the creek bottom, where her people camped. The sheriff's badge glinted in the morning light, and Carl's heart sank. "Chloe," he said quietly, "stay here with the dog. I'm going to ride down and see what's happening." But before he could saddle his horse, gunshots cracked through the morning. Stillness. The dog leaped up, barking, and Chloe ran to the window. More shots followed, then shouts echoed across the snow. Carl grabbed his coat and ran for the barn, Chloe right behind him, despite his orders to stay put. "No, child," he said firmly, catching her arm. "It ain't safe." Tears filled her eyes. "My father," she whispered. The dog pressed against her legs, whining softly. Carl's hands shook as he cinched his saddle. By the time he mounted, black smoke was rising from the creek bottom. He urged his horse forward, but Chloe had already darted ahead on foot, the dog limping beside her. They arrived, to find the camp in chaos. The sheriff and his deputies had scattered the cooking fires, trampled the shelters, and were binding the wrists of several men, including Chloe's father. Women wailed and children cried as their few possessions lay scattered in the snow. "What's the meaning of this?" Carl demanded, dismounting near the sheriff. The sheriff turned, hand resting on his gun belt. "These men stole cattle from the railroad camp. We got witnesses." "That's a lie," Carl said. "I've known these folks since Christmas. They're honest people." "Step aside, McGraw," the sheriff warned. "This ain't your concern." Chloe broke free from where Carl had tried to hold her back. She ran to her father, crying out in Apache. One of the deputies moved to grab her, but the dog darted between them, hackles raised, teeth bared. "Call off your cur. the sheriff ordered Carl, "or we'll shoot it where it stands." Carl whistled sharply, and the dog retreated, still growling. He lifted Chloe away from her father, though it broke his heart to do it. Her father spoke softly to her in Apache, his bound hands reaching to touch her cheek before the deputies shoved him toward their horses. "This ain't justice," Carl said, his voice carrying across the trampled snow. "These people lost their land to the railroad, and now you're falsely accusing them to drive them off what little they got left." The sheriff stepped close, speaking. "Lo, watch yourself, McGraw. A man can lose his grazing rights real quick these days. Might even find himself charged as an accomplice if he ain't careful." Carl held his ground, though his hands clenched into fists. He watched helplessly as the deputies mounted up, forcing their prisoners to walk behind the horses. Chloe's mother approached, gathering her daughter in her arms as they watched the men being led away. "I'll make this right," Carl promised them, "on my word as a Christian man." He rode into town behind the grim procession, watching Chloe's father stumble in the deep snow, but never fall. The dog and Chloe followed despite his protests, keeping to the tree line along the road. By the time they reached Pine Ridge, word had spread and townspeople lined the street. Their faces a mix of concern and uncertainty. Doc Carl tied his horse outside the jail and strode inside. The sheriff sat behind his desk, writing in his ledger, as if nothing unusual had happened. "I want to post bail," Carl said. The sheriff didn't look up. "No bail for Indian thieves. They ain't thieves, and you know it. This is the railroad's doing, trying to clear them off land they want for the new spur line. Careful, McGraw." The sheriff finally met his eyes. "Sounds like you're accusing law officers of corruption. That's dangerous talk." Through the window, Carl could see Chloe standing in the street, the dog pressed against her legs. Several townspeople had gathered nearby, watching and whispering. Some he recognized from Christmas services, where just days ago they'd sung about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. "I aim to see justice done," Carl said quietly. "These are God-fearing people who've done no wrong. That girl out there watched you drag away her father on false charges. What kind of men are we to let such things happen? The kind that understand." "Progress," the sheriff replied. "Railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Best step aside and let it happen. Go home, McGraw. Take the girl with you, if you want, but stay out of this." Carl walked out into the street, his boots crunching in the hard-packed snow. The winter wind whipped down the main street, carrying stinging ice crystals that made his eyes water. Or perhaps it wasn't the wind at all that brought tears. Chloe ran to him, her face questioning. "Father?" She asked. Doc Carl knelt in the snow before her, aware of the townsfolk watching. "We ain't giving up," he promised. "We'll find a way to help." "Him?" The dog pressed close, offering warmth against the bitter wind. Around them, Carl could hear the townsfolk muttering, some in anger at the injustice, others in fear of changing times. He saw Mrs. Peterson from the general store drop her eyes. When he looked her way, saw young Tom Wheeler, whose fence Carl had helped mend last spring, turn his back and walk away. But he also saw the preacher watching thoughtfully from the church steps. Saw old Jake Murphy, who'd fought in the war and knew justice when he saw it, nodding slowly in Carl's direction. The wind picked up, driving loose snow across the street in white sheets. Carl lifted Chloe onto his horse, prepared to take her back to the cabin where at least she'd be warm. The dog limped alongside as they turned toward home. But Carl's mind was already working on what to do next. He wouldn't let this injustice stand. Somewhere between the Christmas peace they'd shared and this bitter mourning, these people had become his responsibility, maybe even his family. The railroad and its pet sheriff might think they could simply sweep aside anyone who stood in their way. But they hadn't reckoned on the stubborn conscience of an old rancher who still believed in right and wrong as they rode out of town. Chloe's tears froze on her cheeks. The dog kept pace despite its healing leg, as loyal and determined as Carl felt in his heart. The winter wind howled around them, but it couldn't drown out the sound of Carl's quiet promise. "We'll make this right, child. Whatever it takes, we'll make this right." The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge's main street as Carl strode into the sheriff's office. His boots left wet tracks on the wooden floor, melted snow dripping from his coat. The sheriff barely glanced up from his desk, continuing to scratch notes in his ledger. "Come to see reason, McGraw?" the sheriff asked, not bothering to look up. "Come to see justice done," Carl replied, his voice steady despite the anger churning inside him. "You know, as well as I do, there's no proof against these men." The sheriff finally raised his eyes, leaning back in his creaking chair. "Got 3 witnesses say they saw Indians driving off railroad cattle. That's proof enough. Railroad men, I reckon. The same ones trying to drive these folks off their winter camp." "Watch your tone," the sheriff warned. "Law's the law. Don't matter who brings the complaint." Through the barred window, Carl could see Chloe huddled on the boardwalk outside, the dog pressed close against her. The sight strengthened his resolve. "Then let's talk about the law," Carl said. "These people have rights. You can't just—" The office door burst open as 2 deputies dragged in their prisoner, a young Apache man Carl recognized from the Christmas gathering. The man's face was bloodied, his hands bound tight enough to leave marks. "Found another one hiding in the creek bottom," one deputy announced proudly. Carl's fists clenched. "You're hunting them like animals. They want to act like thieves. We'll treat them like thieves," the sheriff said, rising from his desk. "Now I've been patient with you, McGraw, on account of your standing in town, but you're pushing my goodwill mighty thin." Chloe slipped in behind the deputies, trying to reach her father's cell. The dog followed, limping but alert. One of the deputies turned, shoving her roughly toward the door. "Get that Indian brat out of here." The dog's reaction was instant. With a snarl, it launched itself at the deputy, teeth snapping at the arm that had pushed Chloe. The deputy cursed, stumbling backward. His hand flew to his holster. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the confined space. The dog yelped, spinning. As the bullet caught its shoulder, it collapsed onto the wooden floor, blood spreading across its patched fur. Chloe's scream pierced the air as she threw herself down beside her friend. "No. No," she cried, both English and Apache words mixing. With her sobs, Carl moved without thinking, shoving past the deputy to kneel beside the wounded animal. The dog's breathing came in ragged gasps, its eyes wide with pain but still alert. "You didn't have to shoot." Carl's voice shook with fury. "It was protecting the child, same as any of us would." The deputy holstered his smoking gun. "Damn cur. Came at me. Lucky I didn't kill it." Carl gathered the dog carefully in his arms, its blood soaking his shirt. "Let me take it to the cell. I can tend to it there. This ain't a veterinary hospital." The sheriff started to object. "You've already shot an innocent creature," Carl cut him off. "Least you can do is let me try to save it." Something in Carl's tone, or perhaps the gathering crowd of townspeople peering through the office windows, made the sheriff hesitate. Finally, he nodded to the deputy to unlock the cell door. Carl carried the dog inside, where Chloe's father sat against the back wall. The man's eyes widened at the sight of his daughter, following Carl in. But he quickly made room on the thin blanket that served as his bed. "Lay it here," he said softly, and careful English. Carl set the dog gently. Its tail thumped weakly against the floor when Chloe knelt beside it, her tears falling onto its fur as she stroked its head. From his pocket, Carl pulled out a clean handkerchief and pressed it against the wound. "Bullet went clean through," he murmured. "That's good. Less chance of infection." The deputies watched from outside the cell, some smirking, others looking uncomfortable. Carl ignored them, focusing on cleaning and binding the wound as best he could. Chloe's father helped hold the dog still, speaking soft Apache words that seemed to calm both the animal and his daughter. "Waste of time," one deputy muttered. "Should have just finished it off." "Like you plan to finish off these people?" Carl straightened up, fixing the man with a hard stare. "Shoot anything that stands in the railroad's way?" "That's enough," the sheriff barked. "You've done your doctoring. Now get out before I decide you're interfering with official business." Carl looked down at Chloe, still crying softly as she cradled the dog's head in her lap. Her father caught Carl's eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of thanks, of trust, of shared understanding about what had to be done. "I ain't backing down," Carl said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. "Not from this, not from what's right." The sheriff stepped closer to the cell bars. "That's your choice, McGraw, but choices have consequences. Railroads bringing progress to this territory. Men who stand in the way tend to lose everything: land, livestock, reputation." "Already lost most everything once," Carl replied, thinking of his wife and daughter's graves on the hill behind his cabin. "Reckon I can bear losing worldly things again. But I won't lose my conscience. Not over this." He knelt one more time, checking the dog's bandage. The bleeding had slowed, and its breathing was steadier. "Tough old creature, like everything else that survived out here. I'll be back," he promised Chloe and her father, with help. The girl nodded, understanding more than her limited English might suggest. Her father spoke softly in Apache, and Carl caught the word for friend among the unfamiliar sounds. As Carl walked out of the jail, townsfolk scattered from the windows, not meeting his eyes. But he walked tall, despite the blood on his shirt and the weight of what was coming. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the shadows on the street, making everything stark and clear. The time for half measures and careful words was past. Carl had drawn his line in the snow, and God help him, he meant to hold it. For Chloe, for her father, for the wounded dog that had shown more humanity than the men with badges, for all of them, he would see justice done or lose everything. In the trying, behind him, the dog's occasional whimper mingled with Chloe's prayers. The sound following him out into the bitter winter air. The cabin walls creaked against the winter wind. As Carl lay in his narrow bed, sleep refusing to come, moonlight filtered through the frost-edged window, casting pale shadows across his wife's Bible on the bedside table. He had not touched it since Christmas Eve, when they had all gathered to read the nativity story together. Apache and settler alike finding common ground in sacred words, now that unity felt as fragile as morning frost. His thoughts kept returning. To the jail cell, to the blood-stained floor and the wounded dog's whimpers. To Chloe's father sitting straight-backed against the cold wall, dignity intact despite his chains. To the sheriff's threats hanging in the air like storm clouds. Everything, the lawman had promised. You'll lose everything. Carl turned restlessly, the rough blankets scratching against his chin. The cabin he had built with his own hands, the cattle he had bred up from a small herd, the reputation he had earned through 20 years of honest dealing, all of it could be swept away. The railroad had that power. They could take his grazing rights, block his water access, turn the town against him until he was forced to sell for pennies and move on, just like they were doing to Chloe's people. From the main room came the soft murmur of Apache prayers. Carl rose quietly and walked to the doorway. Chloe knelt by the dying hearth, her small frame silhouetted against the embers. Her hands were clasped tight, her head bowed as she whispered. Words he could not understand, but whose meaning touched his heart. Such faith in one so young, who had already seen so much cruelty. The sight drew him to the mantel, where he kept the daguerreotype of his own daughter, taken just months before. The fever took her and his wife both. Sarah had been about Chloe's age, with the same unwavering trust that good would triumph. If you just believed strongly enough, he had lost that certainty when he buried them, lost his faith in anything except hard work and solitude. Until a stray dog had led him to a frightened girl in the snow, and he had found himself caring again, despite all his careful walls. "Lord," he whispered, so softly even Chloe did not stir. "I ain't been much for asking favors these past years. Been angry, if I'm honest, but if you're listening, I need strength now. Not for myself. For these people who ain't done nothing wrong except stand in the way of other men's greed." The wind moaned around the eaves, and the fire popped, sending up a spray of sparks. Carl watched them fade into the darkness, remembering another verse from his wife's beloved Bible. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. What was his comfort worth? If he turned away now, what did his possessions matter? If he lost his soul to cowardice? Chloe's prayers had fallen silent. He turned to find her watching him, her eyes reflecting the last glow of the embers. Such trust in that gaze. Such hope. We'll make it right, he said softly. Tomorrow we'll find a way. She nodded, understanding if not the words, then the tone. Rising gracefully, she retrieved her blanket from the corner, where she slept and curled up close to the hearth. Carl added another log to the fire, watching until the flames caught and drove back the shadows. Sleep came easier after that, though his dreams were troubled by the sound of trains thundering ever closer and the echo of gunfire in confined spaces. Dawn came gray and hushed, snow falling in thick flakes that muffled the world. Carl rose early, packed food and blankets, and saddled his steadiest horse. Chloe appeared at his side as he worked, wordlessly helping to secure the straps with small, certain hands. Your father's strong, he told her as they led the horse into the pale morning light. And that dog of yours, he's a fighter. We won't let them stand alone. She gripped his sleeve, speaking rapidly in Apache. Though he could not translate the words, her meaning was clear. Together, they would face whatever came. The snow deepened as they rode toward town, Carl in the saddle with Chloe perched before him, wrapped in his spare coat. The wilderness around them lay pristine and peaceful, unmarked by human greed or railroad stakes. If you looked only at the land, you might believe nothing had changed since the beginning of time. But change was coming, unstoppable as an avalanche. The real choice was not whether to resist it. That was futile, but whether to fight for it. To come with justice, with room for all God's children to live with dignity. Their horse plodded steadily through the drifts, steam rising from its flanks. Carl felt Chloe shiver despite the coat and drew her closer, sharing what warmth he could. She had not complained once, this child of summer lands forced to endure a Colorado winter. Her courage shamed him, who had almost chosen comfort over conscience. The snow began falling harder as they crested the last rise above Pine Ridge. The town lay below them, smoke rising straight from chimneys in the still air. Carl reined in for a moment, studying the familiar buildings with new eyes. The general store where he had traded for 20 years. The church where he had once worshipped with his family. The jail where good men now sat in chains while evil walked free. How many others felt as he did but kept silent? How many looked away, telling themselves it was not their fight? No more, he said aloud, and felt Chloe stir questioningly. No more looking away. They rode down into town as the church bell tolled 8 o'clock. Already, people moved along the boardwalks, hurrying through the snow on morning errands. Heads turned as Carl and Chloe passed. Whispers followed them like shadows. He kept his back straight, his gaze steady. Let them whisper. Let them choose their own paths. He had chosen his. The jail squatted at the end of the street, lamplight glowing behind its barred windows. Outside, a deputy stamped his feet against the cold, rifle cradled carelessly in his arms. His eyes widened at the sight of Carl and Chloe approaching through the swirling snow. Hold up there, McGraw, he called, straightening. Sheriff ain't accepting visitors this early. Not asking his permission, Carl replied mildly, dismounting and lifting Chloe down. Come to see my friends. Your friends? The deputy's laugh held no humor. Since when did you start keeping company with Indian horse thieves? Since I learned the difference between theft and survival. Carl stepped closer, his voice hardening. Since I saw who the real thieves are in this territory. The deputy's hand tightened on his rifle. That's dangerous talk, old man. Railroads bringing prosperity to these parts. Only folks complaining are the ones too stubborn to get out of the way of progress. Progress? Carl felt Chloe small. Hand slip into his, strengthening his resolve. Is that what you call shooting dogs and jailing innocent men? Making children homeless in winter? If that's progress, I'll stand with the stubborn ones. The deputy shifted uncertainly, glancing. Down the street where townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Carl noticed faces he knew. The storekeeper who had warned him about the displaced families. The preacher who spoke of Christian charity. Mothers who had smiled at Chloe during the Christmas service. Would they stand silent now? Or would some find their own courage at last? The snow fell steadier, coating everything in clean white. Carl squeezed Chloe's hand gently, drawing strength from her unwavering faith. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Behind them, hoofbeats approached through the storm. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Carl made his way through the packed benches. Chloe sat with her mother near the front, the injured dog, curled protectively at their feet. The railroad foreman stood at the judge's bench, his voice sharp with certainty. "These people are nothing but thieves," the foreman declared, pointing at Chloe's father. "Taking what belongs to the railroad. The sheriff was right to arrest them." When Carl's turn came to testify, he walked slowly to the front. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he withdrew a folded paper from his coat pocket. The yellow document crackled as he carefully spread it on the judge's desk. "My late wife kept this safe," Carl said quietly, but his voice carried in the hushed room. "It's a land deed from 1853. Shows clear as day that the Cottonwood Camp sits on land granted to the Apache people. Never was railroad property at all." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's face darkened as he studied the deed, unable to dispute its authenticity. The preacher rose from his seat, Bible in hand. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, "hear these words, execute true judgment, and show mercy and compassion. Every man to his brother. We have failed in this command." Townsfolk shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Carl saw heads bowing, shoulders slumping as the truth of their collective silence hit home. Even the sheriff seemed to deflate, his earlier certainty crumbling in the face of true justice. The dog thumped its tail against the floor as if sensing the turning tide. The judge's gavel struck with finality. "I find the defendant innocent of all charges. Case dismissed." A collective exhale swept through the courthouse. The sheriff, face flushed with shame, unpinned his badge and laid it on the judge's bench without a word. He pushed through the crowd and out the door, leaving only the echo of his bootsteps behind. One by one, townspeople approached Chloe's father. "We were wrong," Mrs. Peterson from the general store whispered. "God forgive us." The baker touched his hat in respect, and even the telegraph operator offered a gruff, "Sorry, sir." Carl gathered Chloe and her family close. Together they walked from the courthouse, heads high despite the weight of recent days. Outside, the storm had passed. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, and the bitter wind had gentled to a whisper. Chloe's small hand gripped Carl's arm tight as a vine. He patted it gently, understanding the mix of triumph and worry in her eyes. The law had spoken true at last. But something precious was still missing. The dog had disappeared after they'd carried it from the jail cell, leaving only bloodied paw prints in the snow. Carl had searched the alleyways and called until his voice grew hoarse, but found no trace. Now, even as justice warmed their hearts, that empty space beside them left an ache that even victory couldn't quite heal. Chloe's mother touched Carl's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly in English, the words carrying years of unspoken gratitude. Back at the cabin, Carl ladled steaming stew into tin bowls while Chloe's mother laid out fresh tortillas. The warmth of family filled the small room, but Chloe barely touched her food. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, searching the darkness beyond the lamplight. "Come back," she whispered in Apache. Her words a prayer carried on the night wind days stretched like shadows across the snow. Carl split wood, mended tack, and tended stock while Chloe kept her vigil from the porch, scanning the tree line until sunset painted the mountains purple. Then, one pale dawn, as frost sparkled on the fence posts, movement caught Carl's eye. From the misty woods, a familiar shape emerged, the dog, fur matted but alive, limping steadily toward home. Chloe's cry of joy split the morning silence as she ran through the snow, arms wide. The dog pressed against her, tail wagging weakly as her tears dampened its coat. Carl watched them, his throat tight with emotion. Like a weight lifting from his chest, He felt the answer to countless whispered prayers in their reunion. Warm spring. Breezes rustled the new leaves as Carl's cabin hummed with life. Chloe's younger brothers chased each other through the yard, their laughter mingling with birdsong. The dog, its limp now barely noticeable, trotted along the fence line with renewed purpose, keeping watch over its expanded family inside. The table groaned under shared meals of venison stew and Apache fry bread. Each evening brought new stories, songs weaving together in two languages. On a peaceful Sunday afternoon, Carl opened his wife's weathered Bible, its pages soft with years of devotion. As he read, Chloe's gentle voice translated the ancient words into Apache, bringing new meaning to familiar verses. The lamplight cast a golden glow across the gathered faces. His new family, bound together by love and trust. The dog stretched contentedly by the warm hearth. No longer a lonely sentinel, but the guardian of this blessed home. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here where love speaks softly and stays.